thank you to AFRA for giving us the opportunity to speak today. It's a pleasure to be in front of you. Just to set things off, we have a panel bar on the right that I can see your questions. So as we go through, please drop in your questions. Please vote on other people's questions, and I will try to address them as best as I can at the end of the presentation. And with that said, let's start. So I get the enviable task of presenting how to forecast your networks and do your fleet planning through a COVID market environment, which I'm sure is very challenging, as everybody in this audience I'm surely knows. So a good way to start in addressing this topic is to look at what has transpired over the last 12 months since the COVID pandemic kicked off. What are the trends and what are the expectations of the future, in order to set a foundation around how we should be forecasting what to do with our networks and fleets. So just to kick things off there, we have a graph of capacities that was produced by ICAO, relaying airlines' historic capacities against a percentage of those as it's taken place throughout COVID. You can see that Asia Pacific was hit first. Obviously, they're at the center of the pandemic, and then almost all other regions followed later in March as the pandemic spread. You can see that although Africa is historically a smaller market than the rest, it has been impacted just as much, if not the worst, on a relative basis to the other markets. You can also see that those markets with the larger domestic network or larger domestic market, mainly Asia Pacific, domestic China, and North America, domestic US, have been a little bit more resilient. That's in the orange and red. You can see that in blue we have Europe. There was an uptick in the summer. Everybody was getting quite excited about flying again. But with the recent news of sort of the second spike, the second wave, and more lockdowns, that has reversed. And then you can see it's mainly markets that are more less domestic markets, more international, intercontinental travel, mainly the Middle East, Latin America, and Africa, that have been hit the worst, and that we still have a ways to go before we reach the demand levels and the capacity levels that we had at the start of the year. So let's go to the next slide, please. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so there's been many statistics thrown around so far today, so I won't dwell on them too much. The main point of this slide is just to represent what has happened across our industry, and that there's a need for action from our side in order to ensure airlines are sustainable and viable throughout this pandemic. So just to start things off, January, this was the first time that the World Health Organization was notified of a potential pandemic. As of March, as in the last slide, we saw travel restrictions imposed and capacity start to fall globally. Governments did impose widespread travel restrictions, and to date, about 85% of the globe is subject to some type of travel restriction, whether it's a bar on travel, whether it's quarantine rules put in place that prevent travel, and even in Africa, that number is at 80%. As a result of this, we've seen the collapse of demand. IATA predicts that demand will have dropped 66% versus 2019. And in Africa, RPKs have fallen 87% versus the same month last year for August, and load factors for August averaged 39%, so not great. As a result of this, airlines are clearly over capacity. Our ASKs are down significantly, and approximately 30% of the global fleet is grounded. Now, this isn't a great place to be if you're an airline. As our industry, we're like a large ship. It takes a very long time to move it. We have a large fixed cost base. About 50% of the airline's costs are fixed or semi-fixed, at least in the short term. And so as a result of this, we're seeing and we're expecting to continue to see record losses across the globe. Airlines globally are expected to lose $84.3 billion in 2020, with a negative net profit margin of minus 20%, the worst in our industry's history. So this is not to dwell on the negatives. Obviously, it's been a very challenging year, and it's can continue to be a challenging several months ahead. However, we do need to take action to ensure the viability of our airlines. And today, the main topic of my session is going to be around networks and fleets. But in general, the broad themes of what we need to do is, number one, we need to predict the future as best we can. We need to scale our businesses accordingly. And then we need to model that out and ensure we have sufficient capital to survive through the other side of the pandemic and to see our airlines back into levels of reasonable financial performance. Next slide, please. Okay, so I have the enviable job of pulling out the crystal ball and predicting what the future holds. Unfortunately, my crystal ball is no better than anyone else's. And so, I mean, what happens when you have large amounts of uncertainty like we do now is you do scenario modeling or scenario analysis. And IATA has done the same. And the more uncertainty you have, the more scenarios you put in play. And we're covering already a large portion of the alphabet. So clearly there's a ton of uncertainty, but nonetheless, even though there is uncertainty, we do need to plan and we do need to take action. Next slide, please. So this is I'm not sure if it's simple or complex, but a diagram of what you typically take into consideration when you're doing your network planning. The way the network planning typically kicks off is a combination of your network and your business model, economic growth, air service agreements, travel restrictions, consumer behavior and confidence. Those determine your potential market size. You look at that across routes, you look at that across time. That typically determines your aircraft type. And this also determines the product you want to have on offer. You look at competition. That also has a play in what aircraft types you plan to operate and the products you have to offer. It would be a little bit easier if I had a pointer to take you through this, but so it's a little bit unfortunate, but it will make sense. Your market size and your expected market share determine your passenger demand capture. This then determines what your schedule should be and your utilization, which then determines factors driven by COVID that we need to take into consideration. And we need to be modeling out what we expect the future to look like so that we can reshape our fleets and reshape our networks to best match this. The items that are highlighted in green on the right, these questions are but we do need to be looking at this on an airline to airline basis across each route and across time. And then the last item there, item number 6, relates actually to competition. So there is a silver lining in that there are going to be opportunities where competitors withdraw, competitors don't remain financially viable, and airlines are able to increase market share on certain routes. Next slide, please. Okay, so the diagram on the left this would be an outcome of the analysis from in terms of taking into consideration what levels or future network would be. And so this is presented in terms of an airline's utilization. So you take all those factors into play, you project passenger demand, and then you create a future predicted network. And that would determine these levels of utilization. Now, these different colors represent the different scenario analysis that ICAO has done. We have just applied it to a hypothetical airline. This airline has a 10 aircraft fleet, single type operations. Typically, it would generate 8 block hours of utilization per day. Now we see that this was appropriate at the start of the year. However, utilization levels have fallen, and that given the various scenarios predicted, utilization levels do remain quite down. They are recovering, and this will continue to, as we go through the slides, make a bit more sense. Just one thing I would like to say is that the green line represents what airlines are submitting in terms of their future schedules. However, those are not expected to materialize as travel restrictions do remain imposed. Next slide, please. Okay, so the slide on the left takes this forecasted network in terms of utilization and breaks it down to the average amount of utilization per aircraft per day. So at the start of the year, it was quite reasonable, about 8 hours per day. It dropped quite drastically to less than half an hour's worth of utilization per day. And you can see that over the projected period, it's still expected to only reach probably around 5 hours per day under most scenarios, which is very unoptimal, which suggests that you have too many aircraft for the current market. It's not groundbreaking news. That's just a reflection of what airlines' future schedules or scenarios would indicate. So the second graph here on the right then takes those utilization numbers and labels out what is the required fleet that you would actually need to serve those potential scenarios in terms of your network. And you can see that this fleet, at least for the foreseeable future, is likely only half of the current incumbent fleet. Next slide, please. So this graph is just a continuation of the prior graph. However, we've put a forecasting line out there in order to, I guess, extrapolate based on the scenarios what the future could look like for this hypothetical airline. And so what we would see is that it would take another at least 12 months, likely longer, to get close to the network and the fleet that was required at the start of the year. And so the best way to you need to run this type of analysis in order to support your decision making. And what we would do in terms of how this relates to your future fleet plans is we would put them into buckets. The green bucket here is your core fleet. That's needed now in order to serve your current levels of demand and in order to serve sort of the short-term forecast. Then there's a blue bucket, which is a little bit less certain. This fleet will be required depending on how strongly the market recovers. So you have 4 aircraft in this bucket that you may or may not need. And then you've got a final bucket, which is 1 aircraft for this hypothetical airline, which is aircraft that are highly likely not needed over the next 12 months, perhaps longer, unless the industry recovers faster than expected based on the scenario analysis. So next slide, please. And then based on these buckets, this allows you to make certain fleet decisions, which everybody should be or has been or should be looking at the moment. And depending on which bucket you're looking at, you may be making different choices, and you may have different options available to you. So with the core fleet, no surprises. You need these aircraft. You're not going to sell them. You're not going to park them. But there are other things you can do with them. If the aircraft are financed by debt, or you've paid down the debt, or you didn't use any debt, it's likely you're able to unlock some capital from these assets. You can use the assets as collateral and raise debt capital. You can run a sale and leaseback. And outside of that, if the aircraft are on operating lease, as most airlines are doing at the moment, you can go to your lessors. You can ask for rental deferrals. You can try and convince them to amend your contracts to temporary power by the hour agreements. And these considerations will help you save cash to make it through the rest of the pandemic. Next slide, please. So going into the next bucket, so this is the 4 units where the requirement for these units was a little bit less certain, and it was driven by the market's recovery. You may or you may not need these units. Now here you have a combination of things you can do, some better than others, some more viable than others. and preserve, which most airlines are doing. Percentage of this bucket of charter and ACMI market. So we've seen quite a number of repatriation flights earlier in the year. We've seen other types of ad hoc operations. The market is challenging, but there are some deals out there to be had. There's ACMI deals that are being done in Africa now, some in Asia, some in the Middle East. These are difficult to come by, so you would likely allocate a small piece of your middle bucket to be available for this. So at least it is revenue generating and is generating revenue outside of your core network. Again, you're also able to take these same units because you wish to retain them, and you're able to refinance them, do sale and lease back, or negotiate lease deferrals or power by the hour arrangements, depending on how you finance them or whether they're financed. Next slide, please. And then so the last bucket, which is the one unit that you do not expect will be required for at least the next 12 months or longer, it would not make sense then to just hold this asset, realize the value depreciation, the book value depreciation, and the costs of owning an asset. So there's decisions to make in terms of whether you sell this asset, you can dispose of it outright, you can part it out or scrap the aircraft. If you have aircraft coming off of lease, you can perform lease returns. That's likely going to be the case anyways. Or if you wish to diversify your revenue streams, certain of these aircraft can be repurposed as freighters. Although, unfortunately, this is an immediate solution. There's quite a large lead time on repurposing aircraft. And when you're making these decisions, there's a lot of factors that are going to go into it in terms of the aircraft type, the market's appetite towards that aircraft, what's that aircraft's maintenance condition, that will determine your optimal exit strategy. Now, the prior example was, I'd say, simplified, because if you have forward commitments for aircraft on lease, if you have a forward order book, then this will perhaps push more of your currently owned aircraft into this basket, and you'll have more decisions to make. So next slide, please. Okay, so it would have been ideal if I put a placeholder between these two slides to recap, so I'll just do it verbally. So just coming back to recap on future networks and fleets, the best thing that can be done at the moment, given the uncertainty, is to run scenario analysis. And this is going to change from airline to airline based on your views towards borders opening up, the size of your domestic market versus international market. As you run scenarios, this is going to determine your future network. That will then determine your future utilization requirements. And based on what fleet you have in your airline at the moment, you can group these fleet into various buckets of core fleet, fleet that you will require in the medium term, and fleets that you likely do not require. And off the back end of that analysis, you can make some big decisions around what decisions you make in terms of retaining fleet, returning aircraft to lessors, disposing of aircraft, parking aircraft, etc. So that wraps up the content. I just have 2 slides here. There was a press release earlier this year. We've decided as ACC to partner up with AFRA to support their consulting initiatives. So we have a AFRA Consulting powered by ACC product. What is this? It's a joint initiative between our 2 organizations. You can read the script on the right. It's also on the AFRA's website. But what's the whole purpose of this? Is that AFRA wants to offer its members affordable consulting projects that utilize AFRA, that utilize the unique data AFRA has, that utilize local talent where available. And the benefit for AFRA is that through this initiative, any projects that we undertake, a portion of this will be retained by AFRA to continue to support AFRA's initiatives, such as this one, such as training, and give back to AFRA's members. Next slide, please. So what has been launched is an AFRA Portal online. Many of you would have already seen it if you were part of previous presentations. This is basically an opening where you can provide your aircraft availabilities. You can request statistics. I won't go into too much detail. It can be touched on another call at another time, but just to reinforce this. as one of AFRA's initiatives to help support its members. Okay, I'm just going through the questions. I believe that there's only one question that's somewhat related to my presentation. The question is, what are the biggest challenges that need to be addressed for the airline industry to recover? Well, at the moment, I think it's a combination of travel restrictions. It was mentioned, I think, several times earlier. I think the gentleman from IATA covered it in quite a lot of detail, the main policy issues that need to be travel restrictions, quarantines. These are killing passenger demand, and that's the root of all the challenges at the moment. If we're able to come up with a vaccine, if policies are able to, if we're able to speed up testing so that we're able to test prior to flying and test prior to at the point of landing, I think this will be the fastest way for us to see a recovery in passenger demand, which will then cycle down to all the other benefits.
So there's one from Mamadou Kamara, and he says that you're presenting some very great points on fleet planning. Can you please point out the relevance of fleet planning to the role AFRA should play? My understanding is that fleet is part of an airline strategy. I would suggest that AFRA to focus on economic issues that hinder airline performance.
Okay, so I think the question is a bit broader. So yes, AFRA is, I'm speaking for you, Maureen, here, but yeah. AFRA is a bit more big picture, a bit more economic. You're correct there. However, my organization, ACC, is airline strategy focused. And so we are partnering up with AFRA to offer services that can be a bit more bespoke, a bit more airline centric. And that's why I'm covering this topic on behalf of AFRA Consulting, powered by ACC.
Thank you. And to add to your reaction is that AFRA is partnering with ACC on supporting airlines in various areas, not just on fleet. And we have the AFRA Consulting powered by ACC, which you have also highlighted. So our support to members is to enable them walk through this journey of recovery and to look for solutions that are African based. We're looking for African solutions for African airlines. Thank you.